Good morning, everybody. I had to catch myself because usually good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? My name is John. I am the tattoo historian, and it's great to be up early this morning with my friend, Pete Carmichael, director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. How are you doing, Pete?
I'm doing just fine, John. And it's hard to get used to doing these things in the morning. Scott, we've been doing Mondays and Thursdays at 7 o'clock, but John has been gracious enough for us to do a little bit of an extravaganza today. Your opening, of course, Scott. Extravaganza is to mark what we would have been doing on this day, and that is at Gettysburg College, the opening of the Civil War Institute Conference. So we're doing a scaled back version online. You're leading off, Scott, and then followed by Jen Murray.
Excellent.
And then we're off to the battlefield at 3 o'clock. Is that correct, John? Is that
yes, we'll go live at 3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, yes. And just so the audience knows, I always go to the bullpen before I go on the battlefield. And that bullpen, of course, it's stocked full of National Park Service or former National Park Service historians. Scott was gracious enough last week to take me off we were at the Peach Orchard for a while, and then we were on Cemetery Ridge. And of course, I find out a ton of stuff that I didn't know, and the stuff that I thought I knew, of course, I discover is wrong. So I'm ready to go, John. And
man, yeah, some new information to throw out there for it.
Absolutely. And of course, I've got a scapegoat in Hartwig as well. So I'll say, well, hell, that's what Scott said to me.
Yeah, you already threw me under the bus, right. Murray. So
I did do with you, Jen. I have a habit of doing that to my friend. So today we're going to talk about Scott's book. Unfortunately, not published by UNC, but published by Johns Hopkins. I say that, Scott, not to, of course, lament the fact that this is not in the series, which I wished it was. We've had this discount code that UNC was able to provide, so that's why I'm telling our audiences. But they should still get this. I have the hardback version, signed, I might add, and it's in paperback. That's correct, yes, Scott. It's a paperback. And again, it is a thoughtful book, a book that leads up to right before the day of fighting at Antietam Creek. So it covers the campaign, South Mountain fighting, Harper's Ferry as well. So again, we will get into that. But let me say a little bit about Scott. Again, of course, welcome, Scott. Many of our viewers know Scott. They know Scott from his very long and very successful, very productive tenure at Gettysburg National Park. He's been retired now for a little more than 10 years, or a little less than 10 years, excuse me.
Yeah, jeez. Too far.
Wow.
It's actually 6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
But, Scott, one of the things that John and I have discussed with many of our guests is interpretation on Civil War battlefield parks. We've also talked about the partnerships with academics, and we've seen with many of our guests, including our guest on Thursday, Nina Silber. Silber was one of the first historians that came to the park and had conversations with the park staff about ways to broaden the interpretation of Gettysburg. And time again, John and I have noticed that these connections, these between academics and public historians, that you really can't then conclude that there's this great gap or gulf between these two sides, as I think there once was. So I thought, Scott, we could just open by having you reflect upon how battlefield interpretation, how it changed over time during your career. And then if you wouldn't mind, I'd be really interested in what you see as opportunities or challenges as we look ahead. Oh, and let me add here, very important observation, or I should say fun fact. Fun fact, my girls, Cameron and Isabel Carmichael, I got to give them a little shout out today because they love the Civil War Institute Conference. They say because they get to spend more time with Daddy, but we all know why. It's Mr. G's ice cream. I mean, that's
every time.
They would walk over my dead carcass from Mr. G's, but nonetheless, they love the conference. But their favorite Civil War historian in the town of Gettysburg, it's not Mr. Hartwig. It is Scott. Who is it?
It's my wife.
Absolutely. Barb Sanders. I just want to say one more thing. I've said this on the last show, and I want to make another point, especially at a time that we're going through as a nation, in which it's easy, I think, to not recognize the significant changes that have occurred at Battlefield Parks. And Barb Sanders, who does such incredible and important work in engaging teachers as well as students, she oversees, I believe, the Great Task Program every summer. It is a program that reaches out to communities that are underserved, whether it be in Baltimore or Philadelphia. And we need to remind ourselves that people have not turned a blind eye to the fact that Civil War battlefields have not been as inclusive as we would prefer. But there are people out there that are doing that work. Scott Hartwig's wife, Barb Sanders, is doing just that. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Little advertisement of sorts.
Well said, Pete. Well said. As far as interpretation goes, what I would say is when I started at Gettysburg in 1979, and when I began at Gettysburg, the theme, if you wanted to say the overall theme that a visitor would experience when they came to the park, was the high water mark. That was the real theme. And the focus was on Pickett's charge, and it was on the heroism of the attack on July the 3rd. They had a film that we showed in the Cyclorama Center that it went over a lot of people's heads from these honored dead, but it did get at what the war was about. But it was kind of ancillary. So the primary interpretation you got when you came to the park was you went to the electric map. The electric map explained the movements of the troops, and it was beloved by a lot of people because I think the explanation was very clear. And that was one of the things people liked about the electric map. It wasn't exciting, but it was a very clear explanation, and people could know, oh, okay, so the Union was here, the Confederates were here. And then you went to the cyclorama, and you saw the cyclorama painting, and once again, that was a big focus on the high water mark and the heroism of the soldiers. And then you would walk out from the cyclorama painting, and the idea was to take you out and walk down the high water mark trail and go see where Pickett's charge occurred, and that was your interpretation. Now, we also had a very large museum in the visitor center where the electric map was. That was an amazing collection of artifacts with virtually no theme and no interpretation. It was I would call it, in a way, it was open storage. So, for example, they had the chairs from the Moritz Tavern that Reynolds laid on June 30th, the night before he's killed at Gettysburg. And there was a little inscription in there that said, these are the chairs that John Reynolds laid on in the Moritz Tavern on June 30th. Now, for a Civil War historian, they would see that and they would go, wow, that's really neat. That's really interesting. But for 99% of the people who went through there, they don't know who John Reynolds is. They don't know why these chairs are important. It meant nothing to them. So that's just an example of that. And what we did on the battlefield, there were efforts, I will say, in the 1970s before I got there. There were efforts to try to broaden interpretation. They had a program called Women in the War. They had programs that they tried to talk about civilians, but we did not talk about slavery. We were not encouraged to talk about slavery. We were really focused on telling the story of the battle and telling the story of the battle that occurred within the boundaries of Gettysburg National Military Park. So we didn't do interpretation, let's say, in Gettysburg to talk about the town of Gettysburg or whatever. So our interpretation and our focus was relatively limited. You talked about at the beginning the relationship between National Park Service public historians and academic historians today. We didn't really have much of a relationship at all, I would say, until the 1990s is when it really began. And there were a few things that started to change interpretation in the National Park Service, and specifically at Gettysburg. Because what I always like to say about the National Park Service is when you say National Park Service, you imagine that the entire service is always on board with everything that, say, some park is doing. And the National Park Service is like a navy where every park is its own ship, and they do things kind of their own way at each park. There is some similarities. They wear the same uniform. They do a lot of the same things, but they're not all on board with doing the same type of interpretation. And, some parks are easier to bring along than other parks. And a lot of times it has to do with the person who's in charge of the park, maybe the superintendent, it might be the chief of interpretation. But there was always a feeling I encountered in the Park Service among some people that the only thing we should talk about on the Civil War battlefields is the battle, the soldiers, the battle, the fighting that occurred there. Let's leave it to academics in classrooms to talk about why they were fighting and what the fighting meant. And gradually that began to change. We saw it at Gettysburg. It was kind of ridiculous to do all of these different programs that we did, and visitors would walk away not understanding what any of it meant. And it was brought home to me one day. I was at the angle where Pickett's charge reaches its climax in the battle, and there was a couple standing there at the angle. There weren't many people around, and they were from Britain. And they had seen the electric map, the museum, the cyclorama. They'd done everything. They'd even done a tour of the battlefield. And he looked at me and he said, so he goes, what was this all about? And I never forgot that, because it really brought home to me the failure of what we were doing, that we weren't helping people understand why this was relevant. And one of the key things I learned as an interpreter is that you can have all the facts and figures, all the troop numbers, all the ranks, all the dates of commission, all that sort of stuff. You can know all of that. And if you can't make the story you're telling relevant to the people who are listening, it doesn't matter what you know. You have to make it relevant. What does this mean to me today in my life? Why is this important? Why should I be learning about this? So you have to be able to do that. And we started to, in the 90s, began to broaden interpretive programming that we were offering. And we were experimenting with a lot of different things to see what might work, what might not work. But I would say park-wide, and then it became more service-wide. What really was a big catalyst of change was the arrival of John Latcher as the superintendent at Gettysburg. Latcher had a PhD in history. He was also a colonel in the Army Reserve, so he had a military background. He fought in Vietnam, but he also had an academic background, and he saw the importance of connecting park interpreters with academics. And he put together with Dwight Picaithley, who was the chief historian of the National Park Service, a program where we brought in David Blight, Ed Ayers, Jim Horton, Nina Silber, and some other historians that I might forget their names. I'm sorry if I forget their names, but we brought them in, and we had these workshops with park interpreters. And I'll also add that we brought in a young and very bright academic.
And no gray hair back then.
Named Pete Carmichael, who spent a few weeks with us at Gettysburg National Military Park doing workshops with the park staff in the morning, and then doing public programs, and then also commenting on what we were doing as far as interpretive programs. And the whole experience proved to be very, very eye-opening. It revealed one of the challenges of broadening your interpretation in the National Park Service, and that was the people doing the interpretation. Because I learned that many of the people out there doing interpretation had beliefs about the war that were not grounded in good scholarship. Maybe they'd learned it years ago. Maybe it was their cultural background that they wanted to believe it. But they had a very difficult time coming to grips with some of the realities of what the Civil War was about. What were some of the things that occurred during the war? What were challenges to trying to help people understand those things and interpreting it to the public? And that was a very big limiting factor. I mean, a lot of people would say, you should do this, you should do that, you should do it. And I'm like, those are all wonderful ideas. But until I have the people who can actually go out and do them, you have to move incrementally. You can't just suddenly invent the wheel. You got to build all the spokes on it before you can get the wheel assembled. And so it was an ongoing process all the way up till when I retired at the end of 2013. We were constantly trying to improve ourselves, better ourselves. I would say one of the big advancements that we made was when Latcher was able to put together this public-private partnership, and we built a new visitor center and museum and tore down the old visitor center and cyclorama center. And that gave us the opportunity to really reshape how visitors were prepared for their visit. So we changed the theme, if you want to call it that a visitor would encounter from the high water mark to a new birth of freedom. We also, in the museum, tried to challenge people to see the war in its totality. Why did it come? What were the causes of it coming? What did it resolve? What did it not resolve? And the end of the experience in the museum left visitors somewhat disquieted with it wasn't a happy ending to this whole business. But that was to prepare visitors before they went out onto the battlefield with a licensed guide or went on a ranger program or did a self-guided tour. And that's worked, I would say, imperfectly, because one of the problems with a public-private partnership is the private partner has got to stay financially viable. And that means you have to charge for people to go into the museum. And as the fee for the museum has gone up, I think the number of people going through the experience, the film, cyclorama, and museum has not been what they would like it to be. It has not been what I would like it to be. I'd like to see the majority of people who come to visit Gettysburg go through that experience the first time they come, so that they have a grounded understanding of what the war is about before they actually go out on the battlefield. So that's kind of a broad brush of where we are now. And then since I've left, Chris Gwynn is now the chief of interpretation. And Chris started with me as a college work study years ago in the library, listening to John Heisner and I do impressions all the time. But Chris is now the chief, and he's really, I think, built upon the things that we did when I was there. And he is again, he would be the first to tell you it's an incremental process, but he's really making some excellent progress in developing programming that has a broad reach and tells a broad story.
Scott, I think you point to this incremental change, and you also, I think, which is a good one, and I think it's also a good point that you're part of the Park Service that has a wide range of individuals who come with all kinds of baggage, cultural baggage, and historical understandings that are uniquely their own. And I sometimes get frustrated when people will, in a very anecdotal way, find that Park Service interpreter whose programs are not in keeping with the changes that you've described that have occurred since the 1990s. And I firmly believe that every interpreter has her or his right to interpret those events as they see fit. But what I am frustrated by is pointing to those, what I would almost say exceptions now, but pointing to those individuals to then make the claim that nothing's changed. And what you've described, look, it's a sea change. And
it is, yeah.
what you've described about the museum, that foundational experience, I mean, there is nothing even remotely close to that
No,
anywhere in the Park Service.
no.
And I think you and John and Brian Fitzgerald, who Scott works so closely with, I mean, I'm telling you, for those people who are cynical about the government, and I understand why they are, you know, I hope that you all have an opportunity at some point to connect with someone in federal service like Scott and like Brian and like John Latcher, Barb Sanders. I mean, these people, Chris Gwynn, I mean, the list goes on. Like academics, I'm leaving a lot of people out here, but these are people who are really dedicated and devoted and have done such incredible service to broaden the reach of the park. And as Scott just pointed out, hell, he's not satisfied. I'm not satisfied. No one's satisfied, but it does not do us any good to simply say, we tell the same old stories the same old way, and we talk to the very same people that we always have. That's factually not true. It does great destruction to what we're trying to accomplish. Scott, this issue about cost, and I don't want to pin you down on this, but it worries me a great deal. The visitor experience at the museum is just not accessible to the vast majority of people, regardless of color. Now, I mean, even a lower middle class family would struggle now to pay for their kids, right, and the adults to be able to go through that. Is there a way? Is there an alternative here that we can make it more affordable, or is that a question that's above our pay grade?
Well, you know, I can't say I know the answer to that. I guess what I would say is, if I was still working at the park right now and was in a position where I could make my voice heard, my voice would say one of the goals we need to have is to try to find a way, and we have to consider all options on this, to maximize the number of people who get that experience. That's our goal.
Right.
So when your goal is, we need to make sure that the private partner, in this case it's the Gettysburg Foundation, is financially doing well, if that's your goal, I think your goal is misplaced. I'm not saying that is their goal, but if that is their goal, that goal's misplaced.
Right.
That can't be your goal at a park like Gettysburg. Your goal has to be, we want to educate the public about what happened here and what happened in this war, so that they understand it and that they have a rich experience. And that the financial part of it will adjust to whatever we're able to afford here, right, as far as the number of people who are going through. But we need to try and find that price point at which we can survive with it, but we maximize the number of people who are going through the experience. There were also, I mean, there's some organizational things that when we were planning the museum that ended up getting cut, that for financial reasons, that I think would have helped a lot. One of which was some of the visitor center we designed based upon our experience we had when we'd gone to the Williamsburg Visitor Center, which was very effective. I think it still is, but it was different at the time period we were going through, so that a visitor, when they walked in the doors of that visitor center, the very first thing they all saw was the restrooms. So that eliminated about 90% of the questions the information desk gets, right? That you left the restrooms and you came around a corner and there was an orientation film.
Right.
And the orientation film was pretty short, but it told you all your options, what you could do.
Right.
So the only reason you went to the information desk was you needed to book a hotel room or you needed some specific information. After you left the film, you pretty much knew what it was you wanted to do. So the film was guiding the visitors to do what Williamsburg wanted them to do.
Right.
And that is what we wanted to do. We had an orientation film that was done by Donna Lawrence Productions. It's still there, I believe. Nobody watches it. They don't even know what it is. They think it's they think they're at Walmart and they're looking at a TV doing a commercial. But it is really, the purpose of that film was to prepare visitors on what their options were, so that they knew what they wanted to do, whether they wanted to walk over and buy a ticket for the museum. But it was guiding people to the way to experience this place. The best way is to do the film Cyclorama Museum and then go out on a guided tour of the battlefield. That's your best way to experience Gettysburg. And what happened was, when that was lost, then the visitor kind of wandered around a little bit more, and it was a little bit harder for the visitor to figure out what it is they wanted to do there. And I think that's still an issue at the visitor center. I think visitors like to be guided.
Absolutely.
As to what you are recommending they should do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always, when I worked in the Park Service, and I actually enjoyed working the information desk because it was so critical, right? It was going to make or break that experience. And I would see people who would give a long list of things to the visitor. You can do this, you can do this, this. And I said, you need to first ask how much time they have.
Right.
You only have an hour and you're at Fredericksburg. You tell them there's the movie, right? And walk the Sunken Road. They tell them to drive to Chancellorsville, then Spotsylvania, which after, as we know, after about 2 to 3 minutes, people shut down. They're taking things in. So we talked about this, I think, John and I have. Nothing beats a person-to-person interaction.
Right. That's very true.
Nothing. And I mean, and Scott, let's end on this before we get to Antietam. The immense pride you must feel, though, when you drop Barb off to work and give her a little peck on the cheek to go into that visitor center. That visitor center, right? I mean, you must, again, of all the things you've done in your career, and there have been many, and there's more to come. That visitor center, that must be an immense source of pride for you.
Yeah, I think that was a really unique experience. And, I've often talked about why everything worked out well. And I think it started really, again, with Latcher. Latcher created an environment in which, it's like when we talk about armies, an army commander, whether it's McClellan or Lee or Meade or Grant, they all create a culture in their army. Mm-hmm. And what Latcher did is he created a culture in which all voices were valued and were heard. So I could disagree with him in a meeting and I could voice my opinion, and I felt perfectly fine doing that. There was no egos in the room, nobody trying to control where this thing was going to go and imprint their vision on it or anything like that. I think everybody in the room wanted to make this the best experience that they possibly could. And I think that's why it ended up. I think one of the things that I'm just always delighted with when I walk into that visitor center is the visitor flow in that building works beautifully. Mm-hmm. It works exactly like they hoped it would work. If you ever were in the old visitor center, that was an example on how not to design a visitor center.
It was a mess.
Oh, it was horrible. It was horrible.
It's horrible.
Yeah. One last thing I'll say too about interpretation is Jim Horton one day was at the park, and we were out back of the Cyclorama Center, and he said to me,
"Who's Horton? Tell everyone who Jim Horton is."
Oh, Jim Horton was a professor at George Washington University, and he passed away a few years ago. Just a brilliant guy.
And he edited this book?
Yeah. Yeah.
With his wife, he edited this?
Yes, his wife. Yeah. And he said to me, my job's easy. I've got a bunch of students who need to be there, and they have to listen to me whether they want to or not. But he says, your job, you interpreters, it's tough. They can just walk away from you. They don't have to listen to you. And what he was saying is that when you're out there, you can tell interpreters you need to say this and you need to say that, and you need to bring this in, you need to bring that in. And if they don't have the skills on how to do it, the visitor's just going to walk away if it's something they don't want to hear. So you have to present complicated, controversial topics in the right way, so that you don't turn people off. I've presented a lot of complicated, controversial topics in the course of battle programs that I did, that nobody ever walked away, nobody ever got upset, and it's the way you say it. because you're not trying to label somebody as the enemy and the good guys. And I always remembered that from Jim Horton, and I always valued that advice.
History's not a morality play, and I'll say I'm afraid that we're losing some of that, which of course certainly disturbs me. And of course, when I was young and maybe a little too aggressive with my interpretation, I'd heard one too many lost cause stories at what used to be called the Jackson Shrine, now called the Jackson Death Site. I didn't snap, but I said what I knew would probably get me in trouble, and it did. And I called Jeb Stuart a philanderer, which if you look at the definition, that does not mean you've had an affair. It means that you're flirtatious. And that is, of course, I think it's true. But the person got in her car, drove right to Fredericksburg, and leveled the complaint. And I got some other things like that. So yes, being delicate and respectful is critical in creating a conversation. And it's my hope that people understand that what's happened in the last 2 weeks at Confederate memorial sites, Confederate monuments, that they don't focus on the fact that, oh, these people don't know history, they don't respect history, we're losing our history. Like, I share all of those concerns, but what's happening that's so visible right now, we all again need to remind ourselves that hopefully when we come out of this, that we can create a true conversation, and one that can be respectful, and one in which somebody can honestly say, I have veneration for my Confederate ancestor, and I understand that this was a cause for slavery, but I feel isolated now in a way that I can't talk about how I understand the past. And I worry about that. We still have to create a place in which those conversations can occur without damning one side or the other.
Right. Yeah.
I hope it happens.
Yeah.
Scott, let's get to this.
Okay. All right.
There we go. And did I mention mine's signed? I don't know if I mentioned that yet. I think it's signed. Yeah. So, Scott, you went to Gettysburg your entire career. It makes perfect sense. You write a book on Antietam. What led you to this? And I assume because that you worked on it for quite a while, and we got a second volume to come, and that's what we want to make sure we get to the second volume.
Okay. Yeah. It was like 20 years. Of course, I was raising kids, coaching Little League, working a full-time job, having a life. So in fact, it became a joke amongst people in the Park Service that Hartwig was writing this book on Antietam. They're like, oh, yeah, Hartwig's writing that book on Antietam. Well, I was like the turtle, man. I was just plodding along and eventually got it done. I always had an interest in Antietam. Maybe it was the word Antietam. There's something about that word. And then I think the second thing was Bruce Catton's Mr. Lincoln's Army. His part in there, what he writes about Antietam, was pretty unforgettable when I read it. The most terrific fire anybody had ever experienced, this just terrible, horrific day of violence. And there was something about Antietam that just kind of stuck with me. And then after I got out of college and I got a job in the Park Service, I think it was the very first summer I was at Gettysburg. I was at the information desk with Greg Coco and Paul Shevchek, and we were having a conversation about battles and campaigns nobody had really written a book about in recent times. And Jim Murfin had written The Gleam of Bayonets on Antietam in the early 1960s. Before that, it was the 19th century. Francis Palfrey had written the Antietam and Fredericksburg, and he was a veteran of the Battle of Antietam. Nobody else had written about Antietam. And so I remember I said, yeah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna write about Antietam. Not having any real concept of what that meant. I was very stupid. But that's kind of where it began. Is just having a conversation with some of my coworkers. And Antietam wasn't Gettysburg. It was different. It was a different subject, but it was Civil War. So that also was interesting to me because I didn't want to be working on Gettysburg all 40 hours a week and then come home and then you're working on Gettysburg and you just get Gettysburg out.
Right.
So I think that was the other reason why I moved towards Antietam. And I would say that in some ways I'm Antietam'd out, but in other ways, I'll actually be really sorry to be done with this project because I've come to know these people in a way that that the people who fought the Battle of Antietam and suffered as a result of it, and for the most part, I like them. There's something about them that I like that I'll miss not being around them. A couple of years ago, I went through this collection called the Gould Papers. John Gould was the adjutant of the 10th Maine, and during the battle, Joseph Mansfield, the commander of the 12th Corps, rode down in front of his regiment because Mansfield thought the 10th Maine was firing upon friendly troops in the East Woods. And he was shouting at the men to stop firing. You're firing on your friends. And some of the men in the 10th Maine pointed to Confederates in the woods and they're like, those are not our friends. And then Mansfield gets shot. And John Gould is one of the people who helps Mansfield back from the firing line to an ambulance. Well, afterwards, Gould documented this very meticulously at the time. But in the 1880s, he writes an article in a veterans newspaper called the National Tribune about the death of Mansfield and what he did. And he gets this response. These veterans from the 125th Pennsylvania said, "You're full of hooey. He didn't get shot in front of your regiment. He got shot in front of our regiment. We helped him off the field." So eventually Gould reaches the point. He's like, was I even in the Battle of Antietam? Because all these other veterans started saying, no, he was shot in front of us. So what Gould did is he said, okay, well, let's try to sort this out. So I'm curious. So he started writing men from all the units that had fought in the East Woods about what they knew about Mansfield and the death of Mansfield. And then it grew, his project grew till he was writing veterans, Union and Confederate, from every single unit that fought in the cornfield, the East Woods, that whole area of the battlefield. And it was just this massive, extensive collection of letters from veterans written to a veteran. So I read every one of them. I went to Gettysburg College Library because I could save all the documents as PDFs, so then it was easier to look at them because it was on microfilm. And I remember coming home and telling my wife when I was the last one I'd read through, and I said, I'm gonna really miss those guys. Yeah, I bet. Because one of the things about them that I found interesting was the almost complete lack of animosity amongst Union and Confederate veterans. Almost complete lack of animosity. Just that one Confederate I remember wrote Gould. He said, "On that day, I would have shot you dead." Right. But I'm glad now that we are where we are. Yeah. And I mean, that was the way they put these things. Is they just kind of had a simple way of looking at things in the world that were very matter of fact, and there was something about these people that I liked. I mean, I'm sure if I met them personally, there would be things today you would find that they were people of their generation that you wouldn't like. But anyway, that's what I mean when I say I'll be sorry when I'm done with the project.
Yeah. Fantastic. It is. John, go ahead.
Scott, when you wrote the first volume of this, what was one thing that you really wanted to touch upon really I don't want to say hardcore, but one thing that's like we tend to forget about things that happened before September 17th. It's always like, well, September 17th happened, the capture of Harper's Ferry happened relatively soon before that, but no one, a lot of people forget about South Mountain. A lot of people forget about the buildup of McClellan's movements and such. We had a roundtable discussion last week with Dr. Jim Broomall. We had a discussion about was McClellan really as slow as a lot of people say he was. We had a thing about that, which really got interesting. One when you wrote this book, what was one of the myths or things that we construe that you wanted to really dispel through their words?
Well, I mean, there are a number of myths about the campaign, not as many as Gettysburg, but one of the myths is that, and I'm not a big McClellan defender. There's a group of people out there who really want to make him a great general and think he was much maligned. I think he was an average general. He was a very bright individual. He never could have won the Civil War. He was not capable of doing that. He just wasn't the sort of general who could accomplish that. But one of the narratives that became standard was that McClellan moved very slowly across Maryland. He was indecisive. He was just the same old McClellan of the peninsula. And what I found was that in justice to McClellan, he did an excellent job of reorganizing the army, which was very disorganized from the retreat from the Manassas battlefield and the throwing together of the Army of the Potomac, the Army of Virginia, and then Burnside's Ninth Corps into that mix. I mean, they had not worked together really and functioned as an army. They had their own separate cultures, all of these. So he throws them all together. He has all these political things that are going on behind him. I mean, the Secretary of War is trembling with rage that McClellan is placed back in command of the army. So the government doesn't have his back. Two of his corps commanders that he wants are going to be potentially court-martialed under charges from John Pope, William B. Franklin, and Fitzjohn Porter. So he has to negotiate with Lincoln and the White House and the War Department to get them back for the campaign. And he has to reorganize his army on the march. His army's reinforced by about 17 new regiments. It might even be more than that, but it amounted to a little less than 20% of his infantry was soldiers with literally no training. Literally, like, I go out and gather a group of people in my neighborhood, give them uniforms and weapons, and say, okay, here we go. That's literally what they were young, they were enthusiastic. They did not know how to maneuver. They didn't know anything about their leadership. Their leaders didn't know anything. They'd never marched. So McClellan had to give these men some level of seasoning, at least for marching, so that they didn't just straggle all over creation. That is going to impede how quickly he can move. His logistics were a disaster. So he had to sort his logistics out because you got to feed your men. You don't want your men foraging off the countryside. That's going to slow down how quickly you can move. And then lastly, the chief of staff of the army, Henry Halleck, was deeply concerned that there was a large Confederate army lurking in Northern Virginia, that this was a feint by the Confederates to draw the Union Army away, this movement into Maryland, and that he was moving too far away from Washington and leaving the city vulnerable. This time, different than the Peninsula Campaign, he left the capital a very strong garrison, about 73,000 troops, although that's, big round number. There weren't that many effectives. But he had to be very careful about his movements. He had a vast amount of conflicting information that was telling him where the Confederates were, and he had one of the worst intelligence officers of the war in Alfred Pleasonton, who was his commander of cavalry. Pleasonton, one of the great things about Jeb Stuart for Robert E. Lee is Jeb Stuart vetted his information pretty well that he sent to Lee. Pleasonton sent everything. He didn't vet it. He just sent it all. So McClellan, I think, was faced with a lot of challenges in trying to move his army. And he did move his army pretty efficiently from Washington, D.C. out to Frederick. Once he gets Special Orders 191, he does develop a plan of attack, and he executes the plan of attack. And yes, I do criticize some of his planning, but he wins the Battle of South Mountain. He forces Lee to retreat. He doesn't do well as far as trying to relieve Harper's Ferry, which is going to result in the capture of the garrison there. But there are some things with McClellan. I think that McClellan did pretty well in the campaign. I think what you need to do as a historian is you never want to enter writing something like this with an agenda. I'm going to redeem McClellan or I'm going to demonize McClellan. You want to enter this with, what does the evidence show me about McClellan? So McClellan is one thing that the other, the very long-winded answer here to your question, but the other, one of the big things that I found that had never been told in a without an angle and also in a detailed way was the siege and capture of Harper's Ferry. Mm-hmm. And it always gets glossed over because you have the Battle of South Mountain, you have the Battle of Antietam, and those draw most of the attention away. And it's a siege and it's a capture. There's not a lot of casualties in it. The Union garrison surrenders. It seems like unbelievably inept defense of the garrison. And I thought that's an interesting story that needs to be told. What happened there? It's the biggest surrender of United States troops until World War II. It's the biggest. It is, you know, Stonewall Jackson, everybody remembers him for Chancellorsville and Second Manassas and the Valley Campaign. And, you know, there's good reason to remember him for those things. But I think his greatest victory is the capture of Harper's Ferry. He loses almost very few men, less than 500 men, and captures a garrison of over 12,000 soldiers and all the equipment and the damage it does politically to Lincoln. It's a gigantic victory. It's the biggest capture of Union troops the Confederates execute in the entire war. And it tended to get glossed over in history. I mean, another thing about it that I should point out is that one of the tragedies of the Harper's Ferry surrender was that there was a large number of African Americans, slaves and free people, who had taken refuge within the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry. And of course, when the garrison surrenders, all of them are taken back into slavery. And they offered them back to, if they could determine who the masters of some of the slaves were, they offered them back. Most of these people didn't want their slaves back because they'd run away. They wanted them sold. And the Confederacy used their very limited logistical resources to take these people by rail all the way to Richmond, Virginia to sell them. That's one of the sordid stories of the Antietam campaign that also gets lost in the midst of history.
I had never heard that before. That's I'm not surprised, but that's an important part of that narrative. And, well, let's turn to the Confederates here, Scott. Lee, coming off his victory at Second Manassas, started to inch his army toward Northern Virginia. And there is some debate that he had, in essence, already committed himself to a raid into Maryland without Jefferson Davis's approval. And some historian Steve Woodworth, in fact, argued that Davis and Lee were not absolutely in sync when it came to Confederate strategy on this point. So I want you to, one, answer that. And then the second issue I'd like for you to explore is the movement from Northern Virginia into Maryland. You know, what went right, what didn't go right, and what's your evaluation of Lee? So first part, Lee, Davis, are they in sync here in terms of the raid into Maryland, or is Lee committed and he's already pushed his troops there? And then once he did, how would you evaluate Lee's handling of the army before they get into Maryland?
Yeah, Lee and Davis were absolutely in sync. I think one of the most important books I read about Confederate strategy, and Lee and Davis in particular, is Joe Harsh's book. His first volume that he did, it is, I forget the title of it.
It's to the, I'll look it up.
Taken at the Flood, or I forget the title of it, but it's not a really long book. It's a, I'm going to have to put my window down because the lawnmower is running out here. There we go. All right. It's not a really long book, but it's very important as far as understanding Lee's thinking on strategy and Davis's thinking on strategy. They were absolutely in harmony with one another about what they were going to do. And what Lee was doing when he writes to Jefferson Davis on September the 3rd, you know, he thinks that this is the proper time for the army to march into Maryland. And, if he has Davis's approval, he's going to do it. The reason he's writing that is that he's going to go into Maryland, and he also knows that Davis is going to approve it. But he is simply making a gesture of deference to the civilian control. I'm making sure that you know that this is in keeping with what we've discussed, and you are in charge ultimately. So I think that's all it is. It's just Lee showing deference to Jefferson Davis. I don't think Lee was a far more politically astute than he is generally given credit for.
And we should quickly note, Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, lesser degree Braxton Bragg, all three of those men could have learned a lesson from R.E. Lee in working with Jefferson Davis. And you've got it, I think, how Lee was, and I think also very sincere and believed that civilian authority needed to be informed. But the key word is deference. And Lee, the language that he deployed or employed in writing to Davis time and time again, he made sure that Davis never felt that he was being snubbed.
Right.
You don't snub Jefferson Davis, right?
Right.
There will be no snubbing of Jefferson Davis if you want a military career.
Well, I think it's one of the things that Lee and Grant share in common, in that both of those generals certainly had egos, but they knew where to check their egos and when to check their egos, and when to show deference to the political leadership. And that's one of the reasons I think they were successful as Army commanders. Is they created not just a culture within their army, they created a culture with the political leadership that enabled them to do the things that they thought were going to lead them to victory. And I think Lee was always trying to guide Davis to where he wanted the strategy to go. He wasn't always successful. He wasn't completely successful in the Gettysburg campaign. He wanted Davis to strip some of the garrisons and reinforce his army. I think Lee's thinking was absolutely sound.
Absolutely was.
And Davis, gave into the politics of the moment and felt, we have to defend these places. You've got to execute this campaign with what you've got. So as far as then the Confederates go up into Maryland, and the campaign, it was Lee's thinking on the campaign was good. So he doesn't follow the Gettysburg campaign route, which is down the Shenandoah and into the Cumberland Valley. Instead, what he does is he crosses east of the Blue Ridge South Mountain, and he advances to Frederick. And he knows when he goes to Frederick, he poses a threat to Washington, he poses a threat to Baltimore, and he poses a threat to Pennsylvania. And that is going to draw the Union Army out of the defenses of Washington. That is his objective. It's just like in the Gettysburg campaign, the mistake that people make is they think his objective is to gather supplies, etc. His objective was the Union Army. That is the only, defeating that is the only way you shift the political needle. And that's what Lee is looking for. He knows that army's disorganized. He thinks it's more disorganized than it actually was, but he wants to draw it out of Washington into the field where he can then fight the army and to his advantage. His army is, they are beyond the end of their supply line. So they're really in rough shape, particularly the units that have participated in the Peninsula and the Manassas campaigns. Those units are in terrible condition. Straggling in the army is rampant. The army in Maryland had about 27,000 stragglers.
Wow.
It's a significant portion of the army straggled, and they didn't straggle because they didn't believe in what they were fighting for, or they didn't want to fight for the Confederacy any longer. I think they straggled because they were physically ill, they were completely worn out, and they were really hungry. So and in some units, their battle discipline was great, their march discipline was terrible. So soldiers just straggled off to farmhouses and here and there, and some guys just had enough. And when Lee gets to Leesburg, Virginia, he had a quick reorganization of his army. And we know that at least 5,000 men from the army are deemed not fit to participate in the campaign. They don't have shoes or they're physically unfit. And they ordered them all to go to Winchester, Virginia, where Lee establishes a depot. So we know that he loses at least 5,000 at that point, and then he's just going to leak stragglers everywhere he goes in Maryland and every part of this operation. And his operation that he puts together is really demanding. Right. There's a lot of hard marching that these troops have to do in the course of this campaign. And that's what places some of his objectives at risk, because when he gets to Frederick, he assesses the situation. The Union Army starts to come out from Washington, which is what he wants. But then he learns that the Union garrisons at Harper's Ferry and Martinsburg are still there. And he, rather than seeing that as a problem, he sees it as an opportunity, which is typical of Lee. Mm-hmm. And he conceives a very complicated plan to capture or destroy those garrisons, which ends up dividing his army into 5 pieces. And that's what leaves him vulnerable when McClellan advances across the state, then finds Lee's special orders called Special Orders 191, which are the orders for all the divisions that participated in the Harper's Ferry operation, all the divisions of the Army and what they were supposed to do. And that enabled McClellan to mount an offensive against Lee that nearly ends the campaign. So the night of September the 14th, Lee's army has fought the Battle of South Mountain, and they've essentially been defeated because the Federals have broken through at Crampton's Gap, and up at Turner and Fox's Gap, they've seized the key terrain there. And Lee makes a decision. He's going to retreat to Virginia. And then as they start to fall back on the march towards Boonesboro and Sharpsburg and then across the Potomac, Lee revises the idea because he realizes that Lafayette McLaws, who is at Maryland Heights and in Pleasant Valley, is trapped. He wants to help McLaws get away. So he first decides he's going to halt near Boonesboro, and then he changes his mind. He was going to halt behind a creek near Boonesboro. Then he changes his mind and he decides he is going to, actually it was Keedysville is where he was going to halt. And then he decides that he'll move behind Antietam Creek at Sharpsburg, and he'll set up a temporary position. He didn't intend to fight a battle. Right. It was a temporary position. What changes everything for Lee is on the morning of the 15th of September, he receives word from Stonewall Jackson that Harper's Ferry is going to be surrendered. And when he gets that, Lee is always an opportunist. Lee sees maybe it's going to take McClellan a while to get over the mountain and assemble his army and move up against me. Maybe I can reunite my army. And so that raises the big question that people are always going to ask. And I'm not, I try to answer it, but I think people will continue to ask it. Why does Lee decide to fight a battle at Sharpsburg? Why does he take this enormous risk to assemble his army there with all his hard marching and offer a battle in Maryland? And the interpretation that I came up with is that, again, Lee is an opportunist. The moment he withdraws across the Potomac River into Virginia, he surrenders the initiative to the Union Army. He never likes to surrender the initiative. And if he stays in Maryland and offers battle and defeats McClellan's attack against him, what might McClellan do? Well, you don't know what he's going to do. But what has he done in the past? Well, he might fall back to a strong defensive position, like South Mountain. If he does that, Lee remains in Maryland. The way to Pennsylvania and Hagerstown in Pennsylvania is open, and the campaign north of the Potomac River can continue. That strategically is a win for the Confederacy. And I think Lee takes a tremendous risk here because he sees the potential for a large strategic gain for the Confederacy.
I'll just quickly, I'll send it over to John, and we still have, I think we'll go a little over today, but that's fine if you don't mind, because we'd like to get a little, if you don't mind, little sneak preview of the next volume. But I just want to sort of reflect upon your recent comment, Scott. We're referring to the logistical breakdown that occurred in Lee's army as it made its way through Northern Virginia and into Maryland. I know it's a book that or I should say an article that you cite, is Keith Bohannon did just a fantastic article on the logistics of the Maryland campaign. Of course, focusing just on Lee's army. That piece, and again, I'm usually pretty good at, we do a lot of show and tell here, Scott. I don't have that book in front of me, but it's in Gary Gallagher's edited volume on Antietam. And so if you have any interest in logistics at all, I think Keith was one of the first to really, as Keith can do like almost no one else, he can find archival material all over the place. The other thing that, Scott, we've had a conversation, and I don't think we talked about it last week when we were on the battlefield, is Judkin Browning and Tim Silver's book on the environmental history of the Civil War. They have a fantastic chapter on the Maryland campaign. I suspect none of it would be surprising or new to you, but if I remember, and I'll be a good neighbor, I will PDF it, or you can buy the book. 40% discount, right, John?
Right.
I am a marketer at heart, Scott.
Press love.
We all know that I'm so damn shallow. I should have done marketing. And then the book, which I own, it's upstairs, is Confederate Tide Rising.
Yes.
Confederate Tide Rising.
Yes.
Published by Kent State. Harsh is spelled Harsh. Joseph Harsh, who's unfortunately passed. Confederate Tide Rising. It is, again, if you're interested in these issues, something to consider. Okay, good. John, go right ahead as we're now looking toward September 17th. They get a little sneak preview for our audience as to what's going to come from Scott.
Yeah, we're already getting questions about when is the book coming out. People are ready to jump.
Well, Johns Hopkins is slated it for the spring of 2022. Provided I finish it. No, I'm finished with the battle action of the book. Mm-hmm. So I have a few chapters left where I look at the aftermath of the battle, the end of the campaign, fighting at Shepherdstown, the the Emancipation Proclamation, the reaction of the armies to that, I want to get into, how I think one of the great books on campaigns that I've read in the last decade was George Rabel's book on the Fredericksburg campaign. Mm-hmm. And what I really liked about Rabel's book, other than it was just really well written, is the way he dealt with after the battle. How it was received, how the battle was received in the North and the South, in the press, how it was received by the home front, how people rationalized the deaths of all these young men, and I want to get into some of those things. I mean, Antietam also is important because it's photographed. It's one of the first battles that's extensively documented with photographs. So I'd like to get into that. I'd also like to get into the rebuilding of the Army of Northern Virginia, because that army was damaged beyond what anyone imagines in the Battle of Antietam. They were really, really hurt badly in the battle. And the Army of the Potomac. And, McClellan is making all of these claims that the Army is unfit to take the field. He needs to train it. And he needs to resupply it. I want to look at that rebuilding period. And I also want to look at briefly, there's a number of soldiers who write about after the battle is over. One individual comes to mind. There was a colonel of a New York regiment in the First Corps, and a soldier in his regiment said that the colonel had not come out of his tent. This is after the battle, for a number of days. Nobody saw him. He just stayed in the tent. Rufus Dawes, who was the major of the 6th Wisconsin, writes about feeling sick after the battle for quite some time. William Robbins, who was a major of the 4th Alabama Infantry, his brother was killed. He also had a good friend of his who he was talking to, who had his head taken off in front of him by an artillery projectile. He writes about how he never wrote an after-action report for his regiment because he was ill for quite some time after the battle. I want to get into this idea of how soldiers grappled with trying to deal with the trauma that they had experienced in a battle like Antietam.
Did you, I'm sure you've come across Colonel Lee?
Oh, yes. Yes.
And the Abbott letters, which is just a wonderful set of letters. But Lee disappears, as you know, from his
Yeah.
unit, and they found him, and he was incoherent. He had
Yeah.
had diarrhea. He hadn't changed in days. He had had some issues before he had been captured. There are a number of things, but I'm glad that you're going to look at that issue. Scott, I'm going to ask the question that it's the kind of question that I sometimes am somewhat frustrated with, but I'm going to ask you, and that is, why on this single day, why was the fighting so fierce? Why were there so many casualties? Is there a way that you can help us understand that by getting beyond it's just the bloodiest day? I mean, it has to come to the fact of command decisions, of terrain, of some other things. Could you help us appreciate the singularity of Antietam?
There's several factors at play here. One is that the battlefield, even Gettysburg, has got more cover than Antietam does. Antietam has a few woodlots, but for the most part, the only cover in Antietam is the undulations of the land, which is, if you've ever visited Antietam, it's a very rolling landscape and you can hide huge numbers of troops. But once you're moving against somebody, there aren't a lot of places that there's no fortifications built in Antietam either. So nobody digs in, really. And it is one of the best fields of the Civil War for artillery. And one of the reoccurring themes that I find from soldier accounts that I'm reading is how effective artillery, both Union and Confederate, but particularly Union artillery, if you were on the northern end of the battlefield in a Confederate unit, it was horrific, the losses that they took from artillery fire. And the types of losses that they take are just appalling when you read about them. And just, arms and legs flying and heads flying off and people having shells going right through their bodies. And it's just appalling. So Antietam is a field in which artillery can play a major role in the battle. Yeah. It's a field in which once troops emerge into the open, there is not a great deal of cover for them. That's one of the reasons why we always think of the cornfield, which is a farm owned by David Miller. He had the cornfield in the north end of the field, a 30-acre cornfield in which there was very heavy fighting in the morning. That's the only cornfield everybody talks about, but Mama had a cornfield that was really important. Otto had a cornfield that was really important. And the reason these cornfields became important is because they provided some level of concealment for soldiers trying to move to the attack. But a lot of these attacks, like John Bell Hood's attack, I mean, they're completely exposed. Yeah. And when formed troops are exposed to small arms fire and canister and shrapnel, they just get shredded really, really quickly. Yeah. So, and there's also the case of some very poor tactics that are used in the battle, particularly on the Union side. Edwin Sumner, his tactics are just atrocious that he uses. William French at the Sunken Lane. The tactics are, we're not going to attempt a maneuver. Right. We're just going to pile men in, and we're going to try to overwhelm you with force of numbers. And when you do that, your losses are going to really be high.
Scott, would you agree with Earl Hess's assessment that most Civil War combat usually took place, around 50 yards or less, maybe a little bit more, but certainly under 100 yards? And again, that is, as he would acknowledge, a sweeping generalization, but it also strikes me that that's what often happened in Antietam. Even though they're open, wide fields, the undulating nature of the ground, for opposing lines to come into line of sight, they sometimes had to almost be on top of each other. As an example, I'd say the Sunken Lane. When you stand almost anywhere along that lane, for the Federals, when they become absolutely visible, it's almost as if they're on top of the Confederate position. So is that one? Would you agree with the assessment? A lot of this fighting occurs at close range, and is it the ground again is what almost compels that to happen?
I would not agree with it. I would not agree with it in general. I've got somebody banging on my door right now. What Earl Hess writes is true at Sunken Lane, because you couldn't see the Confederate position until you were about 75 yards away.
Yeah.
And let me just add one other thing about the sunken lane. The sunken lane was a terrible defensive position. Mm-hmm. The only reason I think that D.H. Hill placed his troops in the sunken lane is they couldn't be seen by Federal artillery. Mm. Otherwise, you would have placed your troops at the military crest, which was north of the lane. But he couldn't do that because the Federal artillery would have just smashed them there. So he put them below the crest in the sunken lane. But a lot of Confederate soldiers write about how once the Federals got on the ridge in front of you, you couldn't get out of the lane. Yeah. You were trapped. You were trapped in the lane. And there's a number of accounts from Union soldiers that at one point in the battle, they saw these white handkerchiefs along a part of the lane where G.B. Anderson's brigade was. And I think some of the Confederate soldiers were trying to surrender. But some of the Union soldiers thought it was a ruse, and they kept firing. And then the Confederates realized like they're not going to accept our surrender. We just have to keep fighting. And the fighting went on. It was just unbelievably horrific. But I can find you numerous instances where the engagement takes place at distances of up to 400 yards. Like Roswell Ripley's brigade, when it advances up into the cornfield, part of that brigade is engaging the 12th Corps at over 400 yards. Yeah. And that explains one of the reasons why there were a lot of soldiers in the 27th Indiana and the 3rd Wisconsin who mentioned getting hit, but the buckshot, because they were firing buck and ball, and the balls didn't penetrate their skin. It bruised them because I think the range for those weapons was so great. Right. But there's lots of instances that I can point to where troops are engaging at long distances. Okay. One of the most famous encounters, the 6th Wisconsin, Rufus Dawes writes this great account about when they come out of the cornfield and they see Marcellus Douglas's Louisiana or Georgia brigade across the field in front of you. Well, that's well over 100 yards. That's almost 200 yards away. And the losses in that engagement were really, really high. So, no, I don't think all the engagements took place under 100 yards. At Antietam in particular, I mean, there's a lot of them that are at a 250, 300, 400 yards.
Right. You know, and John, let's go. That's really some important findings. And of course, you don't need me to tell you what to do. But I'd love to see, after you get done with this book, I'd love to see a focused article as Antietam as a case study, because I have great admiration for Earl Hess, and I, as we all know, when we're on the battlefield, you know, people want to understand the nature of the fighting of combat, and with good reason. And
yeah, I read Earl's book. I think it was an excellent book. Yeah.
It is. It's good. It's a very tough issue to generalize.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. John, do we have questions for you or from our audience?
We have a question here from my good friend James Taub. Scott, what's one thing that you don't feel even academics fully understand about the Antietam campaign?
Academics understand everything. Everything. We know all.
Throw that question out, James. Bye. I'll even block you if I have to.
Yeah. That's actually a good question.
Oh, there you go, Pete. It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure, you know, other than some of the things that that I was talking about earlier, particularly with McClellan, I've had academics and non-academics who they just pile on McClellan because he's easy to pile on against. He's his own worst enemy, and they just berate him. He should have done this. He should have done that. He was slow. He was lethargic. He didn't want to fight. He did fight. His battle plan at Antietam was not well communicated. It wasn't necessarily a bad battle plan. I don't think he executed the battle very well at all. But the next day, September 18th, is another example where people just, pile on against McClellan, that he doesn't attack Lee on the 18th. He overestimates Lee's numbers. Well, I point out, I'm like, he isn't the only one. I mean, it's hard to find a Union officer in the Army of the Potomac who didn't think the Confederate Army was as strong as they were, or maybe stronger, because the Confederates had fought so aggressively on September 17th they had effectively masked how weak they really were. And there was a belief that the Confederates were pretty strong. And even though the Army of the Potomac did receive reinforcements, they got an entire division, Andrew Humphreys' division. Humphreys' division had done nothing but march. They had no training whatsoever. They were not going to spearhead any sort of an attack. He had the 6th Corps. He had Couch's division that he brought up onto the field. So he had the 5th Corps, part of the 5th Corps that he could have used. It would have called for a repositioning of some of the troops in his army, which would have taken a considerable amount of time for McClellan. And I think that you can criticize some of his failure to act on September the 18th. I certainly think a Ulysses S. Grant would have acted. But at the same time, it wasn't as if McClellan was an outlier in the army. There was essentially an agreement within the army that attacking on September 18th wasn't a good idea. The army was not in any condition to do it. And I think they would have felt that if Lee had stayed during the 19th, that they should have attacked. But so that's one example. I think that the campaign, like I said earlier, the Antietam campaign does not have nearly the number of controversial moments or myths attached to it that the Gettysburg campaign does. For whatever reason, Gettysburg just has a lot more than Antietam does.
John, do we have any more here? Can we get
one more? One we have a couple seconds for here. Tom Shea wants to know, will the new book include the Battle of Shepherdstown?
Yes.
There you go, Tom.
Yes, there is. I will point out there's a very good book. I just forgot the author's name. I apologize. There's a very good book about the Battle of Shepherdstown that came out a few years ago that gets into a tremendous amount of detail on the battle. So I would highly recommend that.
And there's a pretty good article in the Gallagher Antietam essay as well.
Yes, there is.
Shameful. We won't say anything more about that article. Scott, you know what? Thank you so much for taking your Saturday morning to spend some time with us, and for all you've done. Scott knows this. I've said it to him. When I accepted the job to come to Gettysburg, one of the things that I was so looking forward to was to having Scott as a colleague, which I got to enjoy just for a few years. He told me shortly when I was actually deliberating about whether to come that he was thinking about retiring in a few years. I told my wife, Beth, and she said, do you still want the job? And I said, you know what? Give me some, and it did. Said, I got to think about this because, I knew that this position at the Civil War Institute, that if it was going to work, if the Institute was going to become something I wanted it to become, to build upon the good work of Gabor Bor, that I needed to have an ally and a colleague in Scott. And I got that, and thankfully got Chris Gwynn and others. So for folks this afternoon and our battlefield tour, a lot of what I'll be saying will be Scott Hartwig. I hope I won't screw it up, Scott. I'll do my best.
You'll do great.
What does every good leader do? The problem doesn't reside with me. I'm the ground troops. It resides with the general. So
that's right. That's right. You want to give a show of the book one more time there, Pete, so people can see what they're looking for. Here.
There we go. And in paper.
Yes, in
paperback. Yep.
Get your copy.
Yeah.
Scott, thanks again for taking time out of your day to do
it. Thanks for having me.
Early. I'm not used to early mornings. I gotta get used to this.
Well, I'm up early, so it's fine.
There you go. And thank you again, Scott, and thank you, Pete, for being here. And I'll see you in 2 minutes.
Well,
we get our
Dr.
Jennifer Murray's coming on next to talk about Meade. Thank you all for the comments and questions. We're going to be returning in approximately 10 minutes with Dr. Jennifer Murray. And then don't forget this afternoon, we are going to the Pickett's Charge area of the Gettysburg Battlefield to do a live stream tour for you all, having 4 stops, I believe, there with Dr. James Broomall, Chris Gwynn, Pete, and myself. So that should be a great time. It's a nice 75 degrees outside this afternoon. So we're going to have a good time doing that. So thank you again, Scott. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We'll see you in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks. See you.
Take care, man. Have a good weekend.
Yeah, thanks.